to completely different societies. I don't think that you can look at economics, for example, saying, well, here are certain paradigms laid down by neoclassical economics and we all have to continue with them, when the societies in which people operate, the ideas of ownership and property, the ideas of profit as a reason for living will be seen differently in each society. So that's the good bit of the challenge. The negative bit of fake history, of invention, of WhatsApp forwards that tell you information about Jawaharlal Nehru or about Lord Macaulay, which are invented, is a different sort of problem of technology and modernity. It's one that every country right now is facing. You only have to look at the situation in the United States, where the President of the United States refers to well-researched, accurate news reporting as fake news. I mean, just let that sink in. It's the proper journalism, the high-quality journalism, that is labelled as fake news. And it's very noticeable when people come into universities. So Ahmedabad University, where I'm setting up the new School of Arts and Sciences, but also pretty much every university that I interact with, whether in India or around the world, it's the same issue. It's students coming in, age 17, 18, 19, and actually not having the training in order to distinguish between information that they happen to have read on the internet or on Facebook, which is factually incorrect, and information that can be sourced. And that is playing out in quite scary ways in India right now.
So with your work now as the Dean of Studies? The Dean of a new sort of School of Arts and Sciences, how are you planning to break down silos of discipline, etc., etc.?
So, I mean, in terms of breaking down the academic silos, I think that you can have electives, you can have areas where you've got maybe two professors teaching the same course, where one might bring in the psychology and one might bring in the neuroscience. You can even have a situation where when somebody's coming to do an engineering degree or a management degree, they can also study in areas that are completely outside that specialization. They can do performing arts, they can learn Sanskrit, they can learn about different literatures in different languages. They can say, well, what really interests me on the side is geography, and that can then develop into a minor. But I think that one of the things that's very noticeable among employers in India right now, is the way that students who have very good paper qualifications often don't have the ability to question, the ability to analyze and challenge information and to accurately sort of say why one thing is a better course of action than another. So, all of those things we're trying to build. We're trying to do lots of things at once.
You told me yesterday that you're working on Doris Lessing.
Yes.
I mean, everybody, I think, at some point has had a golden notebook moment, has had I remember reading The Fifth Child when one of my aunts was pregnant, and
you must have been very scared.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I didn't know what was likely to happen. And then I remember starting to read Jenny Diskey's sort of account of being adopted by Doris Lessing and being like the cuckoo in the nest that was pushing out the Doris Lessing's actual son, and that traumatic, tragic. You choose these people.
Well, I mean, for somebody to be an interesting biographical subject, they have to also tell history. So if you're looking at the collapse of European imperialism and the remaking of the world in the wake of empire, Young Husband spans the moment from supreme sort of confidence, self-confidence of the British Empire in India in, let's say, the 1870s, 1880s, to the moment in the 1930s when it's clear that the whole thing is unraveling and either dominion status or independence is on the horizon. In the case of Naipaul, what really made the challenge worth attempting, I thought, was the fact that he was triangulated between Trinidad, where he was born. His grandparents were indentured laborers from India who were sent after the abolition of slavery to cut cane in the fields. And I mean, he had a very, very tough, mean upbringing in colonial Trinidad in the 1930s, which I would argue explains quite a lot of the aspects of his behavior that shock people. If you're brought up in a very, very tough society, you learn certain values, and even if you mask them in a different way, by seeming to be a sort of haughty English gentleman type, as he did after he'd moved to the UK, actually what it's rooted in is that violent rural life in Chagonas, in Trinidad. But the triangulation between India, the land of his ancestors, Trinidad, where he spent the first 18, 19 years of his life, and then sort of England and the world, where he operated out of, that was the challenge. And in the case of Doris Lessing, again, the fact that she wrote 60 or 70 books, I don't even know how many books she wrote, because as soon as you start to count them, you'll get different editions here and there, but about 60 or 70 books, spanning everything from science fiction, space fiction, feminism, communism, her turn against communism, aspects of social comedy, a lot of writing about Africa, writing about Sufism. I mean, all of this at the same time as leading an extraordinarily busy life, having, again, so many lovers that they're like the books. You can't count the lovers. You just get a sort of Excel table and you think, is that John the same as the John who she went to Prague with in 1963? No, that's not that John. That's a third John, And she was busy in every bit of her life. She was engaged in every bit of her life. So the idea of trying to write about somebody who lived for 94 years, who did all of that, was a huge challenge. And also, I'd never written a biography of a woman, and I thought that process of trying to sort of think inside the head of another person, which you have to do when you write history and biography, again would be a challenge that I wanted to try to take on.
And in all these three, I was thinking Lessing is mooring actually, but I decided
I can tell I'm on stage with the writer.
I was thinking actually there is an interesting kind of peripherality to all these three figures. No? Yeah, Francis Young Husband's kind of like you never know what he is. With Naipaul, he is so obviously a British gentleman with a brown skin, and with a name that I've never heard in India. I mean, you've never heard of actually, have you ever heard of a Rushdie also? No. Maybe these are all invented people. They don't exist. So I'm saying there's that level of, and here there is Doris Lessing, who's South African. I mean, has...
Although born in colonial Persia.
Born in colonial Persia. Why don't you tell that,
it's an interesting point, actually. So, so, I mean, well, in the case of Naipaul, the name, I mean, it is probably Pal, but it came out as Paul. I mean, anybody who's been to the Caribbean will know that names of Indian origin come out in very, very strange ways, very strange spellings, which is actually to do with the process of indentured labour. The fact that the person who was noting your name on arrival in the book would not have known the language out of which that name had come. So you get these odd spellings. So, so in Lessing's case, she was born in 1919 in Kermanshah in Iran. Her father had his leg blown off in World War I. In hospital, he'd met and fallen in love with her mother, who was a nurse. They then ended up in southern Rhodesia, and so at that time she was Doris Taylor, or Tigger Taylor. Tigger was her nickname, that she was sort of bouncy and an enthusiastic girl. But she then very quickly got married and divorced, and then got married and divorced again, but she kept the name of her second husband, Gottfried Lessing, who was subsequently, after their divorce, a quite senior diplomat and trade official in the GDR in East Germany. So she had this, this German name attached to the good English Doris.
Which I think brings us about to the end of what we plan to talk about on stage. The rest is, now I open up to the audience if there's anybody who has a question for Mr. French. Open thy beak or it rests silent forever. Can someone get a mic to Mr. Ram in the front row, please?
Just hand it over.
Yeah.
Would you place, I know some of the works, Naipaul is biographical in the strict sense, but what kind of liberties would you take when you exercise literary or literary imagination rather than what professional historians can do? I know you can do both, but how does it work?
So you have to have the evidence for that. There has to be a credible diary entry saying that that was what happened. So if you're going to talk, for example, in the case of Naipaul, about the world in which his father, Sipasad Naipaul, was living as a journalist in Port of Spain, he was a very interesting figure in that he spoke Bhojpuri mixed with local patois. And he taught himself English and became a journalist on the port of on the Trinidad Guardian. So, you know, there I made quite an effort to describe the rum shops of Port of Spain in the 30s and 40s, to talk about the way that buildings looked, to talk about the kind of food that people had, to try to put that sort of surrounding scaffolding that you might expect in a novel, in a work of fiction. But in each case, it had to be the result of an interview with somebody who was there at that time. It has to be a photograph, or it has to be a newspaper cutting. You know, I think providing you can source what you're writing about, providing that you can put in a footnote saying where it's from, you can then take certain creative liberties. But I think that when you read history and people break that, and they get into the idea of sort of, you know, very creative non-fiction, you can normally tell as a reader. You think, well, this may have happened or it may not have happened, but there's clearly no sort of empirical basis for it. It's just it's entertainment, which is fine. I mean, providing it's labelled clearly on the cover.
By the way, all the books, these 3 books are available in Kindle editions on Amazon.in.
Ah, yes.
Young Husband, Tibet, and Nepal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Second row, Mrs. Muthanna. And then,
now you are in the academic field. You're as a writer, you're in the academic field now. How do you create an analytical mind in a student, in every student?
In a student?
Yeah, in every student in a class. How do we get to create an analytical mind?
I mean, essentially by impressing upon them from the minute they walk in that they're not being told what to learn, they're being told how to learn. They're being taught how to question, how to interrogate, how to develop the analytical skills in order to be good life scientists, good historians, good economists, whatever it's going to be. It's not a question of rote learning and repetition.
Yeah. Do lecturers accept that with grace, or do they end up with...
So, I mean, the School of Arts and Sciences is only just over a year old. So when I joined, I think there were 10 or 11 professors, and we now have nearly 30. So everybody who we've hired at sort of very high speed is completely committed to what I'm describing.
Because we kill a questioning mind in a child at a very young age. So they don't have the confidence to stand up to a professor or a teacher. So how do we break from that atmosphere?
It is difficult to make it change. It's you know, it is an effort to persuade students that they should be grabbing the microphone and asking the question. I mean, I always say to students that there is no such thing as a stupid question. Because if you're not understanding what the lecturer or professor is saying, or if you're thinking there's some huge hole in their argument, then you have to ask the question.
Yeah, that is, a professor can be wrong also.
I think
I'll warn you actually that last year I taught a course in Ashoka University, and any students who didn't ask enough questions, I would go around with the microphone and I would just hold it in front of them and say, your turn. And they would have to ask something.
Yeah.
I charge 500 rupees per student who doesn't have a question. You can bet they have a question.
Yeah, you spoke about as a historian, insider. Now, how do you say, as an outsider, while writing, and outsiders.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that the advantage of being the outsider, I wouldn't say this is exactly in relation to being a historian, but I'd say it's more to do with being a writer. That if you come into a society from outside, you notice things and comment on things, observe things, question things in a way that you cannot if you grow up completely inside that particular system. So there will be things that, as an outsider, that you notice, that you observe, and you then can try and incorporate that into your writing. I also think that to write about your own society can be quite hard. I mean, I've only written about England, about the UK in quite a limited way, and I've found it in many ways more difficult. So it's almost as if whatever you're writing about, whatever anybody's writing about, you always have to have a distance on the material. And it's easier to get a distance on the material if you're not totally inside that. Yeah.
Thank you. Sir, I was much interested in the conversation that we were having. It was more interactive, it was more lively. I just have a question for you as a historian. Like, you said that you were interested in the archives, and you said you were passionate about libraries and the archives. So I was interested in this aspect. Like Derrida says in Archival Fever, that the archives are filled with violence. Like he said, the archives in the sense, history or histories, like you said, are filled with violence. So in the sense, are the archives really liberal, or the archives really democratic, or are the archives only filled with vestiges of power? Or in that case, where are the subalterns in the archives? Are they really recorded in the archives? Is there a chance for them to be included in the archives? Thank you, sir.
So I've actually been thinking of this in relation to Ahmedabad University and the starting of an archive, the attempt to start to take collections that will otherwise perhaps be destroyed and trying to bring them in. In other words, what do you make into the archive? I wouldn't say that I agree with the argument that archives are filled with violence, but I do think that almost every archive is filled with dominance. So whoever happens to be in control within that setting is the person who, or the group of people who determine what gets incorporated into the archive. Having said that, you can read an archive laterally, you can read around an archive. It's increasingly easy to actually figure out where material is in the world, what you can look at. It's physically easier to access that kind of material. And there has been amazing work in recent years, in the last decade, where people who are absolutely from the periphery are being incorporated into the writing of history. And I'm not talking here about proscopography, where you simply look at sort of large numbers of people from particular communities and try and figure out what they were doing in the year 1841. Instead, I'm talking about the way that you can take little bits, little snapshots from different archives around the place. For example, there are studies of the period directly after the abolition of slavery in East Africa and in the Indian Ocean, which managed to recreate the stories of freed slaves by going from Durban to Mombasa to, I can't remember which Indian archive, possibly a Bombay archive, and then to 1920s Harlem, where the same person turns up who's come, I think, out of Liberia about 50 years earlier. So that would be an instance where, what sometimes is termed the digital humanities enables you to crisscross between archives and render the kind of lives that tend to get left out. But I just a quick sort of promotion of more traditional elite history, if you like. I have to say that the archives in Windsor Castle, Queen Victoria's personal archives, they are astonishing. There is all sorts of information in there that's never been published because basically access to that archive is really strictly controlled. So even the epicenter of power, that archive can tell you all sorts of new things. Over there.
So my question to you is about your remark on hagiographies. So have you perceived in hagiographies instances of embedded histories and traces of dominance? And it also connects back to your remark on lateral reading of archives. And secondly, your opinions on the landscape of intellectual biographies. Thank you.
Well, I mean, to answer the second question first, I mean, I would argue that intellectual biographies, that intellectual history, you know, the traffic of ideas between periods of time and geographical parts of the world is very often essentially a matter of biography. I mean, why did such and such figure, who became very influential in the history of ideas,